On June 27, 2025, Donald Trump stood before the cameras with confidence. He declared to the world that he had ended the crisis in the Democratic Republic of Congo. A peace agreement had just been signed between the DRC and Rwanda, and Trump called it a new chapter of hope and opportunity. Some African presidents who visited him went even further. They suggested that Trump should even be given a Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts. But reality moved faster than the headlines. Within just a few days, gunfire returned. The M23 rebels resumed their attacks in the north. Last month alone, more than 140 lives were lost. So what happened to Trump's so-called peace deal? Was it ever real, or just another illusion of power? And here's the bigger question. What about the billions in mineral deals tied to this agreement? Cobalt, coltan, copper, resources the modern world cannot live without. Did the United States quietly secure what it wanted while the DRC continued to bleed? Or is this grand deal already falling apart? The truth may be darker than what was announced. Let's find out. On August 25, 2025, Donald Trump once again stepped into the spotlight. With confidence, he told the world that he had ended the decades-long war in Congo. He called it the darkest, deepest part of Africa. For 35 years, it was a vicious war. 9 million people were killed with machetes. I stopped it. I got it stopped and saved lots of lives, he claimed. It sounded dramatic. It sounded historic. But was it true? Trump had made bold claims before. Just as he once repeated false accusations against South Africa, his latest words about the DRC rang hollow. Because on the ground, the reality tells a very different story. Fighting never stopped. The war did not end. Instead, clashes between Congo's army and the M23 rebels continued to claim lives. In mid-August, the violence flared again. Rwanda-backed M23 forces battled local groups loyal to Kinshasa around the town of Mulamba in South Kivu province. Villages were burned, families scattered, and civilians caught in the crossfire. So while the cameras captured Trump's triumph, Congo's war raged on, unseen, unacknowledged, and unresolved. The M23 did not retreat. Instead, they pushed back the local militias and the Congolese army. Heavy gunfire echoed across the hills, mixing with bursts of light weapons in a battle that shook the villages nearby. Within days, reinforcements poured in on both sides. Trucks, fighters, weapons, everything to keep the war machine grinding. Locals watched as their quiet farmlands turned into a battlefield. At the same time, another front erupted. Around the town of Mulamba, just 80 kilometers southwest of Bukavu, the provincial capital, the fighting grew fiercer. Both forces are using heavy weapons, a terrified resident explained over the phone. Bombs are being fired in all directions at Mulamba. The sky thundered with explosions. Homes shook. Families hid wherever they could, knowing a single shell could erase everything in an instant. Recently, Human Rights Watch released a chilling report. It claimed that the M23 rebels slaughtered 141 villagers in July. The organization found evidence of massacres across at least 14 villages in North Kivu province, eastern Congo. The killings happened between July 10th and July 30th in just 20 days. Most of the victims were ethnic Hutus. Human Rights Watch said the attacks were part of an M23 military campaign against the Hutu extremist militia known as the Democratic Forces for the Liberation of Rwanda, or FDLR. Behind the numbers are haunting stories. Families wiped out, villages emptied overnight, entire communities marked as targets in a war that shows no mercy. Witnesses told Human Rights Watch a story so brutal it's hard to believe it unfolded in silence. They said Rwanda-backed M23 fighters carried out summary executions, killing local residents on the spot, entire families, women, children, the elderly, most of them from the Hutu ethnic group living in the Rutshuru area near Virunga National Park. Between July 10th and July 30th, the rebels turned this region into a slaughterhouse. 14 villages and farming communities were hit. Survivors described rebels storming in with machetes and rifles, cutting down anyone in their path. The attacks weren't random, they were organized. Witnesses said the M23 fighters sealed off every escape route. Roads were blocked, villagers were surrounded. There was no way out. One man remembered the horror of July 11th. We woke up and they were there, in large numbers, already on our doorstep. They killed people with guns and machetes. He said 5 members of his family were butchered in the Katanga area that day. Another survivor, a woman, recounted the moment her world collapsed. She watched her husband hacked to death with a machete. That same day, she said, about 70 women and children were rounded up by the riverbank. The rebels ordered them to sit. Moments later, the gunfire began. They told us to sit on the edge of the river, she said, and then they started shooting at us. She survived only because she fell into the water before the bullets found her. But most of the women and children who sat beside her never stood again. For nearly 3 weeks, this was the reality in North Kivu. Villages erased, families scattered, blood in the fields and rivers, while the world's attention remained elsewhere. Another man told investigators he could only watch from a distance as rebels killed his wife and 4 young children, his baby just 9 months old, his eldest only 10. He could do nothing but hide in silence. Locals said the rebels gave them orders: bury the bodies immediately in the fields or leave them unburied. Funerals were forbidden. The dignity of mourning was stripped away. Human Rights Watch reported that M23 fighters even threw bodies, including women and children, into the Rutshuru River, as if to erase the evidence. The horror did not end there. In early August, the United Nations released its own findings. Their investigators estimated that the M23 killed at least 319 villagers during the same campaign in North Kivu. Witnesses also claimed that Rwandan soldiers fought alongside the rebels in these operations. But the denials came swiftly. Both Rwanda and the M23 rejected the accusations. The rebels lashed out at Human Rights Watch, saying the report relied on hearsay, manipulated images, and silence over the crimes of coalition forces. They insisted the massacres could have been carried out by rival groups in what they called a theater of complex operations. Rwanda's government, too, dismissed the UN's findings. Officials branded them gratuitous and sensational, warning that such allegations threatened to undermine fragile peace talks. In a statement to the BBC, Rwanda insisted it had nothing to do with these alleged findings. It added, "The M23 is not Rwanda-controlled, and these questions should be raised with them." Accusations and denials now circle like vultures over Congo. But for the families in North Kivu, the truth is not measured in press releases. It is carved into the graves of their loved ones. Whether the accusations are true or not, one fact remains: the killings have not stopped. Despite Trump's so-called peace deal signed in June, people in Congo are still dying at the hands of rebel groups. The deal, brokered by the US, signed between the DRC and Rwanda, was supposed to end decades of bloodshed. On paper, it looked like a breakthrough. In reality, it was built on sand. As we pointed out before, this agreement was doomed from the start. Why? Because it was signed with the wrong players. The deal was between Kinshasa and Kigali, not between Kinshasa and the armed groups actually pulling the trigger. Congo is home to more than 120 rebel groups. The deadliest among them, the M23, was never at the table. Instead, Rwanda sat there smiling for the cameras while denying again and again that it supports the rebels. But here's the contradiction. The Congolese government and the United Nations both insist that Rwanda is backing the M23. If that's not the case, then why was Rwanda on the negotiating table and not the rebels themselves? The truth is simple. It's not Rwanda's soldiers launching attacks in the villages. It's the M23 and other armed groups. Yet, in Trump's so-called peace signing, the very groups driving the war were ignored. And so the question lingers. Was the deal ever meant to end the war, or was it just another show for the cameras? It's no surprise then that the guns roared again after Trump's peace deal. Reports soon revealed why. The M23 rebels had rejected the agreement outright. They insisted the deal was meaningless without direct negotiations with Kinshasa, demanding that their own political grievances be addressed. With Trump's arrangement collapsing, another mediator stepped in. This time, it was Qatar. Doha offered to host fresh talks, bringing the DRC government and the M23 rebels face to face. On paper, the Qatari deal looked promising. Both sides committed to a ceasefire and a roadmap toward a final settlement. Talks were scheduled to begin on August 8th and conclude by August 18th. But when the deadlines arrived, nothing happened. No progress, no peace. Instead, the agreement fell apart almost immediately under a storm of accusations. The M23 accused Kinshasa of failing to honor its commitments. the Congolese army countered with its own charges, saying the rebels never respected the ceasefire at all. Once again, the ink on the peace agreement dried faster than the blood in the villages. According to recent reports, delegations from both sides have now returned to Doha, Qatar. Their mission, to review the fragile truce signed in July. "We've received the two parties here in Doha to discuss the earlier agreement," said Majed Al-Ansari, spokesman for Qatar's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He explained that the discussions now include plans to create a monitoring mechanism for the ceasefire, as well as an exchange of prisoners and detainees. The United States and the International Committee of the Red Cross are also actively involved, working behind the scenes to keep the process alive. On the surface, it sounds promising: a ceasefire, monitoring teams, humanitarian safeguards. But the real question is far heavier. Will these talks finally bring an end to a war that has consumed Congo for decades? Or are they just another entry in a long list of failed agreements? History urges caution. Too many deals in the DRC have been celebrated in press conferences, only to collapse in the mud of the battlefield. The rebels make promises, the government makes promises, and soon after, the guns speak louder than the signatures. But there's another uncomfortable truth, one that reaches beyond Congo. Why is it that a peace deal for Africa is being hammered out in Doha, a city thousands of miles away? Why not in Kinshasa, Kigali, or Addis Ababa? Where is the African Union in all this? The AU was created to protect Africa, to defend its sovereignty, and to prevent exactly this kind of dependency. Yet when one of the continent's largest, most resource-rich countries bleeds, the AU is nowhere to be found. Isn't it a shame that African leaders cannot take ownership of their own conflicts? Instead, outsiders step in. The US claims the role of mediator. Qatar hosts the talks. The Red Cross monitors humanitarian clauses. Africa, meanwhile, is reduced to a spectator of its own tragedies. And so the question grows sharper. Has Africa been stripped of its ability to solve its own problems, or has it convinced itself that it cannot? Why must peace in Africa always carry the stamp of foreign approval? For Congo, the stakes could not be higher. If these talks fail, as so many before them have, more villages will burn, more families will scatter, and more graves will be dug into Congo's blood-soaked soil. These are the questions that demand answers. But one truth is already clear. This pattern of always looking to the West or outside the continent for solutions is not a smart one. Every time African leaders rush to Washington, Paris, or Doha for help, they strengthen a dangerous narrative. The idea that Africans cannot solve their own problems, that they lack the capacity, the intelligence, or the unity to face their challenges. But we know that is a false perception. It is not about capacity, it is about control. History itself is the evidence. Every so-called help Africa has received from the West has only left the continent weaker. Each intervention sold as a lifeline has, in reality, turned into a chain. Think back. After independence, many African nations faced economic crises. So where did they turn? To Western-led institutions, the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. These institutions arrived with what they called the perfect solution, the Structural Adjustment Program, or SAP. The pitch was simple. SAP would stabilize economies, cut debts, and open Africa to growth. But the reality was devastating. Under SAP, schools and hospitals lost funding. Public jobs were slashed. Prices of basic goods soared as subsidies were removed. And African economies, once struggling but sovereign, became even more dependent on foreign lenders. The very programs that were supposed to save Africa instead crippled it. And so, when African leaders today look outward for help in solving Congo's conflict, they repeat the same mistake. They ignore history. They forget that the so-called solutions of the past often left Africa poorer, weaker, and more divided. African countries went ahead and implemented the structural adjustment programs. And guess what? Decades have passed since then, yet the only results are mountains of debt and broken economies. Ordinary people are left struggling just to survive. The promise of prosperity never arrived, only poverty and dependence. That is just one example. Another is security. When Libya became a problem, some African leaders called on the United States to help deal with Muammar Gaddafi. Washington didn't hesitate. For years, Gaddafi had been a thorn in their side, a leader who refused to bow, who pushed for African unity, who dared to challenge the West. The US grabbed the opportunity and took him out. But what followed was not stability, it was chaos. Libya collapsed into a failed state, torn between rival governments, jihadist factions, and even open-air slave markets. And the damage didn't stop at Libya's borders. The instability spilled southward into the Sahel. Mali became the epicenter of a firestorm, one that soon spread across Niger, Burkina Faso, and beyond. Once again, Africa turned to the West for help. France arrived, branding itself as the savior. French troops set up bases across the Sahel and launched Operation Barkhane, a massive military campaign. But after 10 long years, what was the result? Insecurity was worse than ever. Jihadists expanded their reach, civilians paid the price, and resentment toward France grew stronger with every passing year. The cycle repeated itself. Outside intervention, bold promises, and failure that left Africa weaker than before. Sudan tells the same story. The United States stepped in, promising to help resolve the insecurity crisis. Yet after more than 5 years, nothing has changed. Violence continues. The suffering continues. So, is it really a surprise that Trump's so-called peace deal in the DRC collapsed almost instantly? Of course not. Anyone who looks closely can see the pattern. African challenges are not solved by the West. They never have been. They can only be solved by Africans themselves. It is time for the continent to wake up. Every time African leaders turn to outsiders for solutions, the results are the same: failure, chaos, and dependency. The record speaks for itself. Libya, Mali, Sudan, and now Congo. And this leads us to a crucial point. The solutions offered by the West almost always benefit the West more than Africa. Look at Congo's case. Why did the United States suddenly step forward to mediate a conflict that has been raging for decades, one they had long ignored? The answer is simple: minerals. The DRC president placed a staggering offer on the table, an estimated $24 trillion in mineral wealth, in exchange for Washington's help in solving the crisis. For Trump, securing access to those resources was not just business. It was a matter of national security. And it's easy to see why. Congo holds 60% of the world's coltan reserves. It is also the single largest producer of cobalt, providing around 70% of global supply in 2024. These aren't just numbers. Coltan and cobalt are the backbone of the modern digital economy. Without them, there are no smartphones, no laptops, no electric cars. Congo's cobalt powers the rechargeable batteries in our devices. Its copper is vital for the electrification of transport and energy systems. From solar panels to wind turbines, from Tesla's gigafactories to Apple's iPhones, the global clean energy transition runs through Congo's soil. This is why the US was suddenly interested, not for peace, not for justice, but for access. And the story doesn't end with cobalt and copper. Congo's coltan deposits provide tantalum, a metal so critical that it sits inside almost every piece of modern technology. Tantalum capacitors are what make our smartphones smaller, our laptops faster, and our aircraft systems more reliable. Without tantalum, the digital world as we know it would collapse. The DRC also holds vast reserves of other rare earth elements, metals that fuel everything from advanced weapon systems to clean energy technology. This is the real reason Washington cares about Congo's war. If the US can secure access to these minerals, it can dominate the global transition to green energy and secure an advantage over China, Europe, and the rest of the world. But here's the tragedy. While outsiders fight over Congo's resources, Congolese citizens remain trapped in poverty. The wealth under their feet does not build schools or hospitals. It builds batteries for Teslas, circuits for iPhones, and weapons for wars. So the question is not whether Congo is rich. It is whether Africa's leaders will ever claim that wealth for their people. When will they wake up and stop repeating the same mistakes? Because as the old saying goes, insanity is doing the same thing over and over, expecting a different result. If Africa's future is ever going to change, its leaders must stop looking outward for solutions and start looking inward. They must understand that every time they run to the West for help, they are surrendering the very resources that could make Africa powerful. What are your thoughts? Should Africa continue to rely on outsiders, or should it rise and take control of its own destiny? Let us know in the comments section below. And if you found this video eye-opening, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more stories that uncover the truth behind the headlines.